Frederick Douglass, Chapter 11. You have seen how a man was made into a slave. Now you will see how a slave was made into a man. On one of the hottest days of August 1833, Bill Smith, William Hughes, a slave named Eli, and I were fanning wheat. I was carrying wheat to the fan. Bill was feeding it into the fan. Eli was turning the fan, and William was clearing away the fanned wheat. The work was simple, but, to someone unused to it, exhausting. At about 3 o'clock, I broke down. My strength failed me. I developed a violent headache and dizziness. I trembled in every limb. I stood as long as I could, continuing to stagger with my load to the hopper. When I could stand no longer, I fell, feeling as if I was held down by some immense weight. The fan, of course, stopped. Everyone had his work to do, and the job could not continue if any one of us were absent. Covey was at the house, about 100 yards from where we were fanning. When he heard the fan stop, he rushed to the spot where we were. Bill explained that I was sick, and that there was no one to bring the wheat to the fan. I had by this time crawled into a shady spot, hoping to find relief by getting out of the sun. Covey came to me and asked what was the matter. I told him as well as I could, for I had hardly enough strength to speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side and told me to get up. I tried to do so, but fell back again. He kicked me again, ordering me to rise. I tried again and managed to get to my feet, but as I stooped to get the tub I used to carry the wheat, I again staggered and fell. At this, Covey took up a hickory stick and struck me heavily on the head, making a large wound from which the blood flowed freely. Again he told me to get up. I did not try to rise, having made up my mind to let him do his worst. Covey turned and left me lying there. At this moment I decided to go to Thomas Old, enter a complaint, and ask for his protection. In order to do this, I had to walk 7 miles. Under the circumstances, this was very nearly impossible. I was very weak, as much from the kicks and blows that I had received as by the severe fit of sickness I had experienced. But I watched for my chance, and while Covey was looking another way, I started for St. Michael's. I managed to get a good way towards the woods when Covey noticed me and shouted after me, threatening what he would do if I did not return. I ignored him and reached the woods as quickly as I could. Thinking he would surely catch up with me on the road, I continued to travel through the woods, keeping far enough from the road to avoid detection, but close enough to prevent losing my way. I had gone only a little ways before my strength again failed. I fell down and lay there for some time. The blood was still oozing from the wound in my head. I thought I would bleed to death, but my hair became so matted with blood that it eventually stopped the flow. After lying there about 45 minutes, I forced myself up again and walked on, through bogs and briars, tearing my bare feet at nearly every step. It took me about 5 hours to travel the 7 miles, but eventually I arrived at Thomas Old's store. I must have been a sight to touch anyone who did not have a heart of iron. From the crown of my head to my feet, I was covered with blood. My hair was clotted with it. My shirt was stiff with it. My legs and feet were torn by thorns, and they too were covered with blood. I suppose I looked like a man who had escaped from a den of wild beasts. In this state, I appeared before my master, begging him to use his authority to protect me. I told him what had happened as well as I could, and the story seemed at times to move him. He paced about as he talked, trying to justify Covey by saying he expected I deserved my beating. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted a new home, for that if I lived with Covey again, that he would surely kill me. Thomas Holt ridiculed the idea that there was any such danger. He said that he knew Covey, that he was a good man, and that he could not think of taking me from him. He pointed out that he would lose a whole year's wages if I did not return, that I belonged to Covey for a year, and that I must go back to him. He added that I must not trouble him with any more stories, or that he himself would deal with me. After so threatening me, he gave me a dose of medicine, telling me that I could stay in St. Michael's that night. It was quite late by then, but that I must go back to Covey's early in the morning. He added that he would whip me if I did not comply. I remained all night and, according to his orders, started off to Covey's in the morning, weary in body and broken in spirit. I had had no supper that night, nor breakfast in the morning. I reached Covey's at about 9 o'clock, and just as I was climbing over the fence that divided the neighbors' fields from ours, out ran Covey with his whip. Before he could reach me, I succeeded in getting to the cornfield, where I hid in the tall corn. He seemed very angry, and searched for me for a long time. He finally gave up, thinking, I suppose, that I would eventually get hungry and come out. I spent most of that day in the woods. My alternatives were to go home and be whipped to death, or stay in the woods and starve to death. That night I encountered Sandy Jenkins, a slave that I knew a little. Sandy had a free wife who lived about 4 miles from Covey's. It being Saturday, he was on his way to see her, and very kindly invited me to go with him. I went with him, talking the whole matter over. I found Sandy to be a fine adviser in his way. He told me very solemnly that I must go back to Covey, but that before I went, I must go with him into another part of the woods to dig up a certain root. I must take some of it with me, carrying it always on my right side, and it would make it impossible for Covey or any other white man to whip me. He said he had carried this root for years, and he had never been struck in all that time. I at first rejected the idea, not believing that a root could have any such power, but Sandy pleaded with me, telling me at least it could do me no harm. To please him, I finally took the root, and according to his instruction, carried it on my right side. This was Sunday morning. I started for home, and as I entered the gate, out came Covey on his way to church. He spoke to me very kindly, told me to drive the pigs away from a nearby lot, and passed me by. Now, this odd conduct made me wonder if there was something in the root that Sandy had given me. If it had been any day but Sunday, I could have thought of no other explanation for Covey's conduct. All went well until Monday morning. Then the power of the root was fully tested. Long before daylight, I was called to go rub, curry, and feed the horses. I was glad to obey, but while I was busy in the stable, throwing hay down from the loft, Covey walked in, carrying a long rope. He leapt at me, seizing my legs, and began to tie me up. As I realized what he was up to, I sprang up and, as he was still holding my legs, sprawled to the floor. Covey seemed to think that he had me and could do what he pleased, but at this moment, from where the spirit came, I do not know, I resolved to fight. I seized Covey hard by the throat and stood up. He held on to me, and I to him. My resistance was so unexpected that Covey seemed taken aback. This gave me courage. Covey called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and while Covey held me, he tried to tie my hands. While Hughes was busy with the rope, I gave him a heavy kick under the ribs. The kick not only weakened Hughes, but Covey as well. When he saw Hughes doubled over in pain, his courage failed. He asked me if I would keep resisting. I said I would, that he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and that I would take it no longer. With that, he tried to drag me to a stick that was lying outside the stable door. But as he was leaning over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by his collar and threw him to the ground. By this time, Bill had run in, hearing Covey's cries for help. Covey shouted, "Take hold of him! Take hold of him!" But Bill said that his master had hired him out to work, not to help whip me, and he left. Covey and I fought for nearly 2 hours. Finally, panting and gasping, he let me go, saying that if I had not resisted, he would not have whipped me so much. Actually, he hadn't whipped me at all. He had not drawn blood from me. I had drawn blood from him. The whole 6 months after that I spent with Covey, he never laid a finger upon me. He would occasionally say that he didn't want to have to whip me again. No, I thought, you don't want to, for you will come out of it worse than you did before. From this time on, I was never again what you might call whipped, though I remained a slave 4 more years. I had several fights, but I was never whipped. It surprised me for a long time that Covey did not have me taken by the police to the whipping post, to be punished for the crime of raising my hand against a white man. The only explanation I can think of is this. Covey enjoyed a reputation as a first-class overseer and breaker. The reputation was of great importance to him. If he had sent me, a boy of 16, to the public whipping post, his reputation would have been lost. My term of service to Covey ended on Christmas Day, 1833. The days between Christmas and New Year's Day were the slaves' holiday. We were not required to do any work beyond taking care of the farm animals. Those of us who had families a distance away were generally allowed to spend the week with them. Otherwise, the holiday was spent in various ways. The thinking and industrious ones employed themselves making brooms, mats, horse collars, and baskets. Others hunted possums, rabbits, and raccoons. But by far, the greatest number of us engaged in sports and recreation such as ball playing, wrestling, running, races, fiddling, dances, and drinking whiskey. This last activity was by far the most pleasing to our masters. In the master's eyes, a slave who worked during the holidays hardly deserved them. Such a slave was seen as one who rejected his master's gracious favor. It was thought a disgrace not to get drunk at Christmas. From what I saw of the effect of these holidays, I believe them to be among the slaveholders' most effective ways of keeping down any spirit of rebellion. They served as safety valves to carry off the rebellious spirit of enslaved humanity. They are, in my opinion, part of the gross fraud of inhumanity of slavery. They are supposedly a generous custom, but in fact they are born of the grossest selfishness. The slaveholders love to see the slaves spending those days in a manner that makes the slaves as glad of their endings as of their beginning. The point seems to be to disgust the slaves with freedom by plunging them into the lowest depths of immorality and self-indulgence. For instance, the slaveholder not only likes to see the slave drink of his own accord, but will go to great lengths to make his slaves drunk. One way is to make bets as to which slave can drink the most without getting drunk. In this way, they make the whole multitude drink to excess. So, when the holidays ended, we staggered up from the filth of our wallowing, took a long breath, and marched to the field, feeling, on the whole, glad to leave what our master had told us was freedom, and enter back into the arms of slavery. I have said that this mode of treatment is part of the whole system of fraud and inhumanity of slavery. It is true. The idea is to disgust the slave with freedom, by allowing him to see only the abuse of it. This principle is carried out in other ways as well. For instance, a slave loves molasses. He steals some. His master goes off to town and buys a large quantity. He returns, takes his whip, and commands the slave to eat the molasses until the poor fellow is sick at the very thought of it. The same technique is sometimes used to make slaves refrain from asking for more food than their regular allowance. A slave runs through his allowance and asks for more. His enraged master gives him a large amount and insists that he eat it within a given time. Then, if the slave complains that he cannot eat it, he is said to be impossible to satisfy and is whipped for being hard to please.